Chapter 1, Thirst, Section 2. The afternoon glides slowly past us with its dunes and its silence and its loneliness. After a while, the loneliness is broken by a group of Bedouins who cross our path. 4 or 5 men and 2 women, mounted on dromedaries, with a beast of burden carrying a folded black tent, cooking pots, and other utensils of nomad life, with a couple of children perched on top of it all. As they come upon us, they rein in their animals. "Peace be with you." And we answer, "And with you be peace and the grace of God." "What is your destination, O wayfarers?" "Taima, inshallah." "And whence come you?" "From Qasr Athaymin, brothers," I reply, and then there's a silence. One of them, a gaunt, elderly man with a sharp face and a black, pointed beard, is obviously the leader. His glance also is black and pointed. When passing over Zaid, it rests suspiciously on me, the stranger of light complexion, who has so unexpectedly appeared from nowhere in this pathless wilderness, a stranger who says he is coming from the direction of British-held Iraq, and might well be, I can almost read Sharp-Face's thought, an infidel surreptitiously entering the land of the Arabs. The old man's hand plays, as if in perplexity, with the pommel of his saddle, while his people, now loosely grouped around us, obviously wait for him to speak. After a few moments he seems to be unable to bear the silence any longer, and he asks me, "Of which Arabs art thou?" meaning to what tribe or region I belong. But even before I am able to reply, his features light up in a sudden smile of recognition. "Oh, I know thee now. I have seen thee with Abdul-Aziz, but that was long ago, 4 long years ago." He stretches his hand in friendliness towards me, and recalls the time when I was living in the royal castle at Riyadh, and he came there in the retinue of a Shamar chieftain to pay the respects of the tribe to Ibn Saud, whom the Bedouins always call by his first name, Abdul-Aziz, without any formal honorific title, for in their free humanity they see only a man in the king, to be honored no doubt, but not beyond the deserts of man. And so we go on for a while reminiscing, speaking of this man and that, exchanging anecdotes about Riyadh, and in and around which up to 1,000 guests live daily off in the king's bounty, receiving on departure presents that vary in accordance with each man's status, from a handful of silver coins or an abaya to the heavy purses of golden sovereigns, horses, or dromedaries, which he frequently distributes among the chieftains. But the king's generosity is not so much a matter of the purse as of the heart. Perhaps more than anything else, it is his warmth of feeling that makes the people around him, not excepting myself, love him. In all my years in Arabia, Ibn Saud's friendship has lain like a warm shimmer over my life. He calls me his friend, although he is a king, and I a mere journalist. And I call him my friend, not merely because throughout the years that I have lived in his realm he has shown me much friendliness, for that he shows to many men. I call him my friend because on occasion he opens his innermost thoughts to me as he opens his purse to so many others. I love to call him my friend, for despite all his faults, and there are not a few of them, he is an exceedingly good man. Not just kind-hearted, for kindness of heart can sometimes be a cheap thing, as you would admiringly say of an old Damascene blade that it is a good weapon because it has all the qualities you could demand from a weapon of its kind. Thus do I consider Ibn Saud a good man. He is rounded within himself and always follows his own path, and if he often errs in his actions, it is because he never tries to be anything but himself. My first meeting with King Abdul-Aziz ibn Saud took place at Mecca early in 1927, a few months after my conversion to Islam. The recent sudden death of my wife, who had accompanied me on this, my first pilgrimage to Mecca, had made me bitter and unsocial. I was desperately striving to clamber out of darkness and utter desolation. Most of my time was spent in my lodgings. I had contact with only a few people, and for weeks I had avoided even the customary courtesy call on the king. Then one day, while visiting one of Ibn Saud's foreign guests, it was, I remember, Haji Agus Salim of Indonesia, I was informed that by order of the king my name had been entered on his guest list. He seemed to have been apprised of the reason of my reserve, and to accept it with a silent understanding. And so, a guest who had never yet seen the face of his host, I moved into a beautiful house at the southern end of Mecca, near the rocky gorge through which the way to Yemen passes. From the terrace I could see a large part of the city, the minarets of the great mosque, the thousands of white cubes of houses with roof balustrades of colored bricks, and the dead desert hills domed by skies that glared like liquid metal. Still, I might have gone on postponing my call on the king had it not been for a chance encounter with Amir Faisal, his second son, in a library under the arcades of the great mosque. It was pleasant to sit in that long, narrow room surrounded by old Arabic, Persian, and Turkish folios. Its stillness and darkness filled me with peace. One day, however, the usual silence was broken by the swishing entry of a group of men preceded by armed bodyguards. It was Amir Faisal with his retinue passing through the library on his way to the Kaaba. He was tall and thin, and of a dignity far beyond his 22 years and his beardless face. In spite of his youth, he had been given the important position of Viceroy of the Hejaz after his father's conquest of the country 2 years earlier. His elder brother, Crown Prince Saud, was Viceroy of Najd, while the king himself spent half the year in Mecca, the capital of the Hejaz, and the other half in the Najdi capital, Riyadh. The librarian, a young Meccan scholar with whom I had been friendly for some time, introduced me to the prince. He shook hands with me, and when I bowed to him he lightly tipped my head back with his fingers, and his face lit up in a warm smile. We people of Najd do not believe that man should bow before man. He should bow only before God in prayer. He seemed to be kind, dreamy, and a little reserved and shy, an impression which was confirmed during the later years of our acquaintance. His air of nobility was not assumed. It seemed to glow from within. When we spoke to each other on that day in the library, I suddenly felt a strong desire to meet the father of this son. "The king would be happy to see thee," said Amir Faisal. "Why dost thou shun him?" And the next morning the Emir's secretary fetched me in an automobile and took me to the king's palace. We passed through the bazaar street of Al-Mala, slowly making our way through the noisy throng of camels, Bedouins, and auctioneers, selling all kinds of Bedouin wares, camel saddles, abayas, carpets, water-skins, silver-inlaid swords, tents, and brass coffee-pots. Then through a wider, quieter, and more open road, and finally reached the huge house in which the king resided. Many saddled camels filled the open space before it, and a number of armed slaves and retainers lounged about the entrance stairway. I was made to wait in a spacious pillared room whose floor was laid with inexpensive carpets. Broad, khaki-covered divans ran along the walls, and green leaves could be seen through the windows, the beginnings of a garden which was being grown with great difficulty out of the arid soil of Mecca. A black slave appeared. "The king invites thee." I entered a room like the one I had just left, except that it was rather smaller and lighter, one side opening fully onto the garden. Rich Persian carpets covered the floor. In a bay window overlooking the garden the king sat cross-legged on a divan. At his feet on the floor a secretary was taking dictation. When I entered the king rose, extended both hands, and said, "Ahlan wa sahlan," family and plain, which means, "You have now arrived within your family, and may your foot tread on an easy plain." The most ancient and gracious of Arabian expressions of welcome. For just a second I was able to gaze in wonderment at Ibn Saud's gigantic height. When, by then aware of the Nejdi custom, I lightly kissed the tip of his nose and his forehead, I had to stand on my toes despite my 6 feet, while he had to bend his head downward. Then, with an apologetic gesture in the direction of the secretary, he sat down, pulling me to his side on the divan. "Just a minute, the letter is nearly finished." While he quietly continued to dictate, he also opened a conversation with me, never confusing the two themes. After a few formal sentences, I handed him a letter of introduction. He read it, which meant doing 3 things at once, and then, without interrupting his dictation or his inquiry after my welfare, called for coffee. By that time I had had an opportunity to observe him more closely. He was so well proportioned that his huge size, he must have been at least 6.5 feet, became apparent only when he stood. His face, framed in the traditional red and white checked kufiya and topped by a gold-threaded igal, was strikingly virile. He wore his beard and mustache clipped short in Nejdi fashion. His forehead was broad, his nose strong and aquiline, and his full mouth appeared at times almost feminine, but without being soft, in its sensual tenderness. While he spoke, his features were enlivened by an unusual mobility, but in repose his face was somehow sad, as if withdrawn in inner loneliness. The deep setting of his eyes may have had something to do with this. The superb beauty of his face was slightly marred by the vague expression of his left eye, in which a white film was discernible. In later times I learned the story of this affliction, which most people unknowingly attributed to natural causes. In reality, however, it had occurred under tragic circumstances. Some years earlier, one of his wives, at the instigation of the rival dynasty of Ibn Rashid, had put poison into his incense vessel, a little brazier used at ceremonial gatherings in Nejd, with the obvious intention of killing him. As usual, the brazier was handed first to the king before being passed around among his guests. On inhaling the first whiff, Ibn Saud immediately sensed that there was something wrong with the incense, and dashed the vessel to the ground. His alertness saved his life, but not before his left eye had been affected and partially blinded. But instead of avenging himself on the faithless woman, as many another potentate in his position would surely have done, he forgave her, for he was convinced that she had been the victim of insuperable influences at the hands of her family, who were related to the house of Ibn Rashid. He merely divorced her and sent her back, richly endowed with gold and gifts, to her home at Hail. After that first meeting, the king sent for me almost daily. One morning I went to him with the intention of asking, without much hope of its being granted, permission to travel into the interior of the country, for Ibn Saud did not, as a rule, allow foreigners to visit Nejd. Nevertheless, I was about to bring this matter up when suddenly the king shot a brief, sharp glance in my direction, a glance which seemed to penetrate my unspoken thoughts, smiled, and said, "Wilt thou not, O Muhammad, come with us to Nejd, and stay for a few months at Riyadh?" I was dumbfounded, and so, obviously, were the other people present. Such a spontaneous invitation to a stranger was almost unheard of. He went on, "I would like thee to travel by motor car with me next month." I took a deep breath, and answered, "May God lengthen thy life, O Imam! But what use would that be to me? What good would it do me to whiz in 5 or 6 days from Mecca to Riyadh, without having seen anything of thy country beyond the desert, some sand dunes, and perhaps, somewhere on the horizon, people like shadows? If thou hast no objection, a dromedary would suit me better, O long of age, than all thy cars together." Ibn Saud laughed. "Art thou thus tempted to look into the eyes of my Bedouins? I must warn thee beforehand, they are backward people, and my Nejd is a desert land without charms, and the camel saddle will be hard and the food dreary on the journey. Nothing but rice and dates, and occasionally meat. But so be it. If thou hast set thy heart on it, thou shalt ride. And after all, it may well be that thou wilt not regret having come to know my people. They are poor, they know nothing, and are nothing, but their hearts are full of good faith." And some weeks later, equipped by the king with dromedaries, provisions, a tent, and a guide, I set out by a roundabout route to Riyadh, which I reached after 2 months. That was my first journey into the interior of Arabia, the first of many, for the few months of which the king had spoken grew into years. How easily they grew into years, spent not only in Riyadh but in almost every part of Arabia, and the saddle is hard no longer. "May God lengthen the life of Abdul-Aziz," says Sharpface. "He loves the Bedou, and the Bedou love him." And why should they not, I ask myself. The king's open-handedness toward the Bedouins of Nejd has become a standing feature of his administration. Not a very admirable feature, perhaps, for the regular gifts of money, which Ibn Saud distributes among the tribal chieftains and their followers, have made them so dependent on his largesse that they are beginning to lose all incentive to improve their living conditions by their own endeavors, and are gradually lapsing into the status of dull receivers, content to remain ignorant and indolent. Throughout my conversation with Sharpface, Zaid seems impatient. While he talks with one of the men, his eyes frequently rest on me, as if to remind me that there is a long way before us, and that reminiscences and reflections do not quicken the camel's pace. We part. The Shamar Bedouins ride away toward the east, and soon disappear behind dunes. From where we stand, we can hear one of them intone a nomad chant, such as a camel rider sings to spur his beast and to break the monotony of his ride. And as Zayd and I resume our westward course toward far-off Taima, the melody gradually fades away, and silence returns.